The Excelver Dominion had ruled the stars for centuries, crushing countless civilizations beneath its warships, enslaving species, and bending entire worlds to its will. To them, war was nothing more than a display of dominance, a way to remind the galaxy who controlled it. And when their scouts discovered Earth, a small, unremarkable planet on the outer edges of their expanding empire, the Dominion saw an opportunity for yet another effortless conquest. The humans had no interstellar fleet, no planetary defenses that could challenge a battle-hardened empire, and no presence in the grand affairs of the galactic stage. To the Dominion, they were nothing more than insects to be trampled beneath the boots of progress. The Grand Council, filled with overconfident warlords, dismissed any concerns about resistance. "They will fall within a single cycle," the Supreme Commander had declared, his voice echoing through the great halls of their war council. "We will not waste time with negotiations. Conquer them. Show them the price of standing in our way." The invasion force was assembled in record time, a fleet of colossal warships, bristling with weapons that had reduced countless worlds to submission. The Dominion believed it would be nothing more than a formality: arrive, demand surrender, and if refused, unleash devastation until nothing remained but ash and obedience. As the fleet tore through space toward Earth, the Excelvar commanders barely paid attention to their target. They spent their time boasting about how easily they would break this primitive world, how they would mount human leaders on spikes as a warning to other civilizations. They laughed at the idea that such a fragile species could resist them, completely unaware that they had just made the greatest mistake in their empire's history. When the Dominion fleet arrived in Earth's orbit, the first transmissions they sent were demands for surrender. They broadcast their ultimatum in every human language, announcing that resistance was futile, that their world now belonged to the Dominion, and that those who fought back would face total annihilation. They expected immediate compliance, as had happened with weaker species before. Instead, they were met with silence. Then came the response: not a surrender, not a plea for mercy, but a simple statement from a human leader that was broadcast to every ship in the fleet. "If you want our world, come and take it." The Dominion commanders were amused at first. They assumed it was nothing more than empty bravado, the final act of defiance before an inevitable fall. They ordered their ships to begin orbital bombardments, targeting major cities with their plasma cannons. Explosions tore through the land, skyscrapers crumbled, and fire spread across human settlements like a plague. The Dominion had done this 100 times before, and each time, the result was the same: panic, chaos, and unconditional surrender. But something was different this time. Even as the cities burned, even as the sky was filled with fire, the humans did not break. They did not kneel. They fought. The first wave of Excelvar ground forces was met with something they had never encountered before: an enemy that refused to accept defeat, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Human soldiers fought like demons, using their knowledge of the terrain to ambush and eliminate entire platoons. Civilians, instead of cowering in fear, armed themselves with whatever they could find and turned their streets into war zones. Every building became a fortress, every alley a death trap. The Excelver soldiers, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves caught in a nightmare. Their advanced technology gave them an edge, but the humans fought with a savagery and determination that defied all logic. And when an Excelver officer was captured and brought before human commanders, he was given a message to deliver back to his superiors: "You should have never come here." The Dominion commanders grew frustrated. They sent more forces, unleashed greater destruction, but it only made the humans fight harder. Instead of breaking under pressure, they adapted. They hijacked enemy supply lines, turned the Dominion's own technology against them, and used psychological warfare in ways the Excelver had never experienced. The Dominion soldiers, once proud warriors who had never known fear, now whispered in terror about the humans who would rather die than surrender. The arrogance of the Dominion was starting to crack, replaced by something they had never felt before: doubt. What the Excelver had failed to understand was that humans were not like the other species they had conquered. Where other civilizations had collapsed under fear, humanity thrived in adversity. Their history was built on struggle, on wars that had tested them to their limits and forged them into something far more dangerous than the Dominion could comprehend. They were not just another species waiting to be enslaved. They were something far worse, an enemy that refused to die. As the battle raged on, a realization began to creep into the minds of the Dominion's warlords. This was not going to be an easy victory. This was not going to be a simple conquest. And for the first time in their empire's long and bloody history, they faced the possibility that they might have underestimated their opponent. The humans had been given no reason to hold back, no mercy to consider. The Dominion had come to take their world, but in doing so, they had awakened something far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. And as the fires of war consumed Earth, one undeniable truth became clear: the HFY Dominion had challenged the wrong species. The HFY Dominion had always believed that strength came from superiority, superior technology, superior firepower, and superior numbers. Their entire empire was built on this philosophy, and for centuries, it had never been challenged. When they launched their invasion of Earth, they thought it would be another routine conquest, an easy campaign that would end with humanity crushed beneath their rule. Their first mistake was assuming humans would surrender. Their second mistake was thinking the war would be over before it even began. But their greatest mistake, the one that would haunt the Dominion for the rest of its existence, was underestimating just how dangerous humans could be when pushed to the edge. The first wave of attacks was designed to cripple humanity's ability to fight back. The HFY fleet bombarded major cities, targeting infrastructure, communication networks, and military bases with relentless precision. Fire and destruction rained down from the sky as entire districts were reduced to rubble. The Dominion had done this before, and in every previous invasion, the pattern was the same: panic, surrender, submission. But something strange happened this time. Instead of falling into chaos, humanity adapted. Instead of cowering in fear, they retaliated. And instead of surrendering, they fought back with a level of resistance the HFY had never encountered before. Human forces moved quickly, their response swift and brutal. Cities that should have been easy to occupy became death traps. HFY ground troops found themselves facing an enemy that refused to fight by the rules of conventional warfare. Human soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, struck from the shadows, using the ruins of their own cities to launch devastating ambushes. Civilians who should have been helpless turned into deadly insurgents, setting traps, hacking enemy communication systems, and even using captured weapons against their invaders. It was chaos, the kind of war the Dominion was never prepared to fight. The HFY were used to direct battles, overwhelming their enemies with sheer force. But here, on Earth, they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting an entire species that had decided that if they were going to die, they would take their enemies with them. At first, the HFY commanders dismissed the resistance as nothing more than an annoyance. They sent more troops, confident that brute force would crush the last remnants of human defiance. But as the battles dragged on, something terrifying began to happen. Their forces started disappearing. Whole squads would go on patrol and never return. Military convoys would be ambushed in the dead of night, leaving nothing but burning wreckage and the bodies of their soldiers scattered across the roads. Even their warships in orbit weren't safe. Several Dominion vessels suffered catastrophic failures after being hacked by human cyber warfare units. The HFY had always believed themselves untouchable in space, yet somehow these primitive humans had found a way to turn their own technology against them. The fear started to spread through the ranks. HFY soldiers, once fearless conquerors, began hesitating before stepping into human-controlled zones. They whispered of ghost soldiers, humans who could strike from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Their commanders grew frustrated, ordering harsher measures, more aggressive tactics. But the more they escalated, the more humanity adapted. What the Dominion had failed to understand was that war was nothing new to humans. Their history was filled with conflict, with battles fought in trenches, in jungles, in deserts, and in the depths of ruined cities. Every strategy the HFY used had already been seen before. Humanity had fought wars of attrition, had learned how to wage guerrilla campaigns, had perfected the art of making their enemies bleed for every inch of land. The Dominion had entered this war believing they were fighting a weak, primitive species. Now, they were starting to realize they had awakened a nightmare. Desperation set in among the HFY leadership. They needed to make an example, to show humanity that resistance was pointless. A high-ranking Dominion general ordered an attack on a heavily populated city, deploying a new type of biological weapon that was meant to wipe out all human life in the area. The attack was swift, merciless, and completely effective until the humans retaliated in a way the Excelver never saw coming. Within hours of the attack, human scientists had analyzed the biological agent, found a way to neutralize it, and turned it back against the invaders. Entire Excelver encampments were exposed to the very weapon they had unleashed, and within days, thousands of Dominion soldiers were dead. The humans didn't just counter the attack, they made sure the Excelver paid for it. What had once been an easy conquest was now turning into a disaster. The Dominion had thrown everything they had at Earth, yet the humans refused to break. In fact, they were only growing stronger. Excelver warships, once symbols of ultimate power, were now being hijacked mid-battle, their crews massacred by human strike teams who had infiltrated them. The Dominion's command centers, once untouchable, were now being targeted with precision bombings. Every advantage the Excelver thought they had was being stripped away, one by one. The humans weren't just fighting to survive anymore, they were fighting to win. And then, the moment came when the Excelver realized the truth: they were losing. Not just the battle, not just the invasion, this was the beginning of the end for their empire. Their fleet was in disarray, their forces demoralized, and their leadership fractured by infighting. The galaxy had always feared the Excelver Dominion, had always assumed they were unstoppable. But now, for the first time in history, the Dominion itself was afraid. They had made a mistake, a fatal, irreversible mistake. They had challenged humanity. And now, they would pay the price. The war was not going as planned. The Excelver Dominion had arrived with the confidence of conquerors, expecting another swift victory, another world added to their empire. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. What should have been an easy campaign had become a slow, grinding disaster. The humans would not surrender. They would not break. And worst of all, they were learning, adapting to every tactic, turning every weakness of the Dominion into a weapon. Now, the fear that the Excelver had once instilled in others was starting to take root within their own ranks. It started as whispers. Soldiers speaking in hushed voices about the battles they had fought, about comrades who had gone missing in the night without a trace. Patrols sent into ruined cities simply vanished, leaving behind only scattered weapons and dried pools of blue Excelver blood. At first, the commanders dismissed these reports, blaming incompetence or human ambushes. But then the stories became stranger. Survivors from these disappearances spoke of shadows moving in ways that defied logic, of human forces that could strike without warning and melt away into the ruins before anyone could react. Some claimed to hear human voices taunting them over stolen comm channels, whispering threats in perfect Excelver dialect. Others swore that they had seen their fallen comrades walking again, only to realize too late that they had been strapped with explosives and sent back as living bombs. The Dominion had expected humanity to fight with honor, to accept their fate like so many before them. Instead, they had learned the terrifying truth: humans did not fight fair. They did not follow the rules of war. They fought as if their entire species depended on it, and in a way, it did. They turned the ruins of their cities into mazes of death, using fire, smoke, and deception to disorient the invaders. They studied Excelver tactics and twisted them into deadly traps. And they took prisoners not for ransom or negotiations, but to learn, to extract information, to expose the weaknesses in the Dominion's war machine. The fear spread like a plague. Excelver soldiers began refusing to patrol at night, claiming that the darkness belonged to the humans. The once proud warlords of the Dominion, who had never before questioned their own superiority, now sat in their war rooms in silence, reviewing battle reports that made no sense. How could a species so technologically inferior be winning battles against an empire that had conquered thousands of worlds? How could their greatest warships be hijacked by soldiers who had never set foot on another planet before? How could their most elite strike teams, trained for decades in the art of war, be outmaneuvered by resistance fighters who had been civilians just weeks ago? The answer was simple: The Excelver had made the mistake of underestimating the sheer relentless nature of human survival. Every species they had conquered before had surrendered when faced with overwhelming power. But humans did not surrender. When pushed to the brink, they fought harder. When threatened with extinction, they became something even worse than an enemy. They became hunters. And now, the Excelvar were the ones being hunted. Desperation took hold of the Dominion's forces. Some units began retreating without orders, abandoning their posts in fear of being the next victims of the humans' merciless tactics. Others turned to extreme measures, ordering mass executions in occupied territories, believing that if they killed enough humans, the resistance would finally break. But it did not work. Instead of crushing the human spirit, it only fueled their hatred, their rage, their drive to fight until the last breath. Every act of cruelty was repaid tenfold. Every atrocity was met with a retaliation so brutal that even seasoned Excelver generals shuddered at the reports. The true breaking point came when an entire Dominion warship, the Veil of Supremacy, was taken over by a group of human infiltrators. What should have been an impossible feat became a message to the rest of the galaxy. The Excelver officers aboard never had the chance to send a distress signal. The crew disappeared, one by one, as the humans moved through the ship, silent and methodical. By the time the ship's command center was breached, there were no Excelver left alive to resist. The Veil of Supremacy was turned against its own fleet, its weapons systems hijacked, its targeting coordinates rewritten. By the time the Dominion realized what had happened, several of their own ships were nothing more than burning wreckage drifting in space. The last transmission received from the Veil of Supremacy was a human voice, calm and cold, delivering a final message to the Dominion High Command: run. Panic erupted across the Excelver forces. The fear that had begun as whispers had now become an unstoppable force, eating away at their morale, their discipline, their very will to fight. Some commanders still believed victory was possible, but deep down, they all knew the truth: the war had already been lost. Not because of numbers, not because of superior weapons, but because the Dominion had made a fatal mistake. They had thought humans were just another species waiting to be conquered. They had thought fear was a weapon that only they could wield. Now, as the once mighty Excelver war machine crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance, they understood the truth too late. Fear did not belong to the Dominion anymore. It belonged to the humans. The Excelver Dominion had spent centuries building its empire through fear. They had crushed worlds, exterminated civilizations, and forced entire species into submission with overwhelming power. To them, war was a hunt, and they were always the hunters. Their fleets swept through the galaxy like an unstoppable force, leaving only ashes in their wake. But then, they made the mistake of invading Earth. What they had thought would be an easy conquest had turned into a nightmare, one that refused to end. The humans had not only resisted, they had learned, adapted, and retaliated with a level of brutality that shook the very core of the Dominion. The hunters had become the hunted, and now the Excelvar were the ones running for their lives. At first, they tried to convince themselves that it was only temporary, that the humans were just stubborn, that they would eventually break. But as the war dragged on, something terrifying became clear. The humans were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for vengeance. They did not care about surrender or negotiation. They did not fight for territory or power. They fought to destroy the invaders, to drive them out, to ensure that no Excelver would ever set foot on Earth again. And worse, they were taking the fight beyond their own world. Selver ships, once feared across the stars, now found themselves hunted. Human strike teams infiltrated their fleets, planting explosives in key locations, crippling entire warships before vanishing without a trace. Dominion supply routes, once untouchable, were now graveyards of burning wreckage, ambushed by human forces who struck with terrifying precision. The humans had no fear of fighting in space, no hesitation in attacking ships many times larger than their own. They did not care about the odds. They cared only about making the Excelver suffer. On occupied worlds, the Dominion's forces were being wiped out. Human operatives, once simple soldiers, had become something else: shadows in the darkness, hunters that moved unseen, striking when the Excelsior least expected it. Entire outposts went silent overnight, their garrisons slaughtered, their weapons stolen and turned against their own kind. No one knew how the humans were doing it. They did not use the Dominion's advanced technology. They did not have the numbers. But what they did have was an unbreakable will, a relentless drive to fight until the last Excelsior was either dead or running. Fear spread like a sickness. Dominion soldiers abandoned their posts, too afraid to face what they now called the ghosts of Earth. Commanders who had once spoken of victory now whispered of retreat. Some even tried to flee, only to be hunted down by human ships waiting in the darkness of space. There was no escape. Every system the Dominion controlled was being targeted, every fleet they sent was being torn apart. The humans had done something no other species had ever dared to do. They had turned the war around. They had stopped defending. Now they were the ones hunting. The Excelsior High Command, desperate to understand what had gone wrong, ordered a full retreat from Earth, hoping to regroup and counterattack later. But the humans did not let them go. As the Dominion's forces tried to escape, human warships pursued them, striking without mercy, ensuring that no invader left the system alive. What should have been a withdrawal turned into a massacre. Entire fleets were wiped out before they could even reach the safety of hyperspace. The few ships that did escape carried nothing but broken soldiers, their minds shattered by the horrors they had witnessed. But humanity was not finished. The war did not end with Earth's liberation. The humans were coming for the Dominion itself. One by one, the Excelsior's conquered worlds fell silent. The same fear that had once paralyzed humanity was now consuming the Dominion. They had thought themselves untouchable, yet now their own planets were under attack. The humans struck military bases, supply depots, and shipyards deep within Excelsior territory. Nowhere was safe. The final blow came when a human fleet appeared in orbit above Excelsior Prime, the heart of the Dominion. The impossible had happened. The war had been brought to their homeworld. Their mighty defenses, once thought impenetrable, were breached within hours. Fires raged across the capital as human forces landed, fighting their way through the streets with terrifying efficiency. The Excelsior leadership, once proud and arrogant, now cowered in bunkers, desperately trying to find a way to escape. But there was no escape. The humans had made their message clear. The war was over. The hunters had been hunted down. And now, the Dominion, the great empire that had ruled the stars through fear, was no more. And in its place, only humanity remained. The Dominion had ruled the stars for centuries, their name spoken in hushed whispers across countless worlds. They were conquerors, their fleets unstoppable, their armies unmatched. They had crushed civilizations, shattered empires, and erased entire species that dared to resist. To them, war was not just conquest, it was a demonstration of their superiority. They had expected Earth to fall like all the others. It had not. And now, the name that once brought fear across the galaxy was no longer Excelsior. It was human. It began as a simple resistance. A planet refusing to surrender, a few scattered armies fighting against impossible odds. The Dominion had laughed at the human defiance, amused by their primitive weapons, their outdated tactics. But the laughter had stopped when human ships, small and outgunned, began striking at their supply lines with surgical precision. It turned into frustration when entire Dominion outposts disappeared overnight, their soldiers vanishing without a trace. And it became terror when they realized that every battle, every skirmish, was a lesson for the humans, one they learned faster than any species the Dominion had ever encountered. The Excelsior had always believed in fear as their greatest weapon. But now, they were the ones who feared. Their commanders, once so confident, now hesitated before sending troops into battle. Their soldiers, once disciplined and fearless, now flinched at the sound of an unrecognized voice over their comms. The humans did not fight like other species. They did not adhere to the Dominion's rules of war. They struck when least expected, vanished before retaliation, and used the very tactics the Excelsior had perfected over centuries against them. Entire Dominion fleets burned in the void, their wreckage left as a warning for others. Human operatives infiltrated Excelsior command structures, feeding false information, sowing paranoia. The Dominion's greatest warships were stolen right from their own shipyards, turned against their former masters in a brutal display of human ingenuity. No matter what the Excelver did, no matter how many forces they sent, the result was always the same defeat. The Dominion's leaders were slow to accept the truth. They still believed in their own invincibility, still convinced that humanity was nothing more than a nuisance to be eradicated. But as the war dragged on, something changed. It was not just about battles lost, it was about what the survivors said. Those who escaped encounters with the humans spoke of horrors the Dominion had never faced before. The humans did not just kill. They dismantled. They broke the enemy, piece by piece, until nothing remained but fear. Prisoners were spared, but not for mercy. The humans used them, extracted information, turned them into unwilling informants. Interrogations did not rely on brute force, they relied on something far worse. The prisoners were released back into Dominion ranks, carrying with them the weight of what they had seen, what they had heard. They whispered of unseen weapons, of shadowy figures who knew their every move, of a force that could not be stopped. And with every whisper, the fear grew stronger. The final sign of their downfall came when the Dominion's own people began to abandon them. Some defected, offering intelligence to the humans in a desperate bid for survival. Others fled, disappearing into the void, refusing to fight a war that had already been lost. And then there were those who simply surrendered, believing that captivity under the humans was better than facing them in battle. The once mighty warlords of the Dominion sat in silence as they watched their empire crumble, not to a superior military, not to overwhelming firepower, but to a force they had underestimated. No longer were the humans just another species in the galaxy. They had become something else, something unstoppable, something that every surviving Excelver, every conquered race, every ruler who had once feared the Dominion now spoke of with a new kind of terror, a name that brought fear, a name that would never be forgotten: humanity.